Coming to you from Boise, Idaho, the fastest growing city in the U.S. and recognized as one of the most creative and vibrant cities to live in. This is a special edition of Enhancing the Human Experience, a World of Creativity, a series of unique interviews with successful people from around the globe, how they get inspired, where their ideas come from, and how they apply creativity in their business and personal lives. Now, here's your host, Mark Phillips, along with special guest interviewer, Mark Stinson.
Okay, we've got another great interview here for our World of Creativity series within Enhancing Human Experience. Welcome, Mark.
Well, hi. How you doing, Mark?
Great. So who we got here on the other line?
It's a terrific episode we've got planned for you. We're going to be talking with Paolo Mercado, who's in Manila in the Philippines. And Paolo is by profession, he's working as a senior vice president at Nestle Philippines in marketing, communications, but an interesting title added onto that is the area of innovation. Mm-hmm. So I thought from a creative standpoint, Paolo's got a lot of things to share with us.
Sounds great.
Obviously, before Manila, he also worked in Nestle in China, and so has a broad view of Asia and the dynamic markets there, and all the creative stimulation and inspiration that we can draw from that. So, Paolo, we're really glad to have you on the podcast today.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Glad to be in the show. Yes.
Yeah. So, Paolo, as a communications, marketing, and innovation person, I think to start with, what sort of projects are you working on today?
Well, broadly speaking, for Nestle Philippines, so one of the, let's say, the most time-consuming creative work that we do is all the advertising, and we come up with quite a number of ads every year. So advertising production, including all of the digital marketing work, is a constant stream of work that my department helps to supervise on behalf of the brands. And we work with the ad agencies or the digital agencies to produce that work. So I would say that occupies a good chunk of my time together with my team. And the other aspects of that, of course, what feeds into the advertising work is all of the market research and business analytics. So that also is a major part of the process that we go through. And then last, of course, not the least, I wish I were spending more time on this one, is the innovation part. And the innovation part is, I would say at this point, isn't so much managing each and every innovation project of Nestle Philippines, because there are project managers for that embedded in the business units, but rather helping guide the process of innovation from opportunity identification all the way to ideation, screening, and of course, eventually the launch plans that go with it. So that's in a nutshell the scope of my role in Nestle Philippines.
Yes. And remind us some of the product lines and brands, because I'm sure we recognize them. Nestle is a terrific global brand in and of itself, but what are some of the brands underneath that umbrella?
Yes. So among the global brands that we handle in the Philippines, of course, there's Nescafe. So I would say that's the best known globally. And then we have, let's say, regional brands like Milo. So Milo is a chocolate malt beverage, similar to Nesquik, but much more sports oriented or sports positioned in the developing markets. And then we have our powdered milk brands. So those are quite local. So Bear brand is our biggest one. And then we have our confectionery brands. So Kit Kat is also in the market. So I would say those would be some of the most recognizable brands.
That's terrific. All brands I enjoy.
Yeah, no, right.
Yeah. It's great to talk about Nestle.
Yes.
Well, that's terrific. And so, Paolo, from a creative standpoint, and this is the basis of our conversation, is really the creative process and sort of where ideas come from, right? I loved your thought that, the basis of all these campaigns, the advertising is the fun output. but the market research and the analytics, the real getting to know the customer. Tell
Yes.
us a little bit about how you get a sense of what the consumer is looking for and maybe what their problems are. How do you go about understanding that with your teams?
Right. So, well, actually, this is quite. It's been quite a journey to bring, I would say, consumer centricity in all of the marketing communications that we do. When we take a look at so I'll talk on two levels. I would say one is the Nestle way, or what we call brand building the Nestle way, and what is prescribed in that way of working. And the other one is my own approach to it, or my own take to it. So in let's say the global approach that we have, there are always a couple of fundamentals that we need to have in order to build great brands. And the first one is a very clear understanding of a well-defined target consumer. That is the consumer that we choose to delight, and not just the broad consumer that we just you know the core target that we want to love us, rather than everybody who we just want to like us. So
Yes.
getting very, very focused on a core narrow target consumer is the first step, and the first fundamental that we build. um, uh, in parallel to that, there must be a very clear understanding of what the brand is all about, what we call the brand essence and the brand purpose, and how those two link together on, let's say, a very deep level. So if the core target, for example, is working class Filipinos who who really have to work hard to uplift themselves and their families, and the role, for example, that Nescafe plays in helping those people rise up each and every day and face the hard realities of life in the Philippines, and the role that cup of coffee plays in giving them that little boost every morning to do that. So we keep true to that, and that is articulated in what's called the creative big idea. And then from the big idea, whether it's a product specific communication or a more uplifting brand equity communication brief, we then tailor fit the communication tasks according to the business needs of, let's say, generating demand for particular products, or for strengthening the brand equity we have with the target consumer. So that is, I would say, broadly the basics of it. What I am, or what I try to push with the marketing community in the Philippines, is two parts. One is bringing back the consumer intimacy into, let's say, the work rhythm of the marketing teams. Because as in many organizations and many big corporations, we are very data heavy, report heavy, and sometimes the tendency is that we pay a lot more attention to, let's say, the performance of our sales, pushing into key customers, or looking at our sales offtake levels or things like that. And we lose the time and intimacy that we actually spend on the field with consumers, and just getting to know them on, let's say, a life level, before trying to essentially push our demand targets on them. So getting into the habit, and helping our marketing teams get into the habit of spending time with consumers, for me, is important. Um, and for me, that's foundational, because that's empathy work. And with empathy, and with the habit of empathy building over time, we get to pick up the insights that happen more on the life level, that then enriches our, not only our communications, but from time to time, it also enriches the innovation ideas that we have.
Wow.
That's wonderful. I really admire that idea of empathy, and delight, and how you contribute to the life. What you were describing about Nescafe's role, for example, it's a cup of coffee, yes, but it's a boost, and it's a kickoff, to what might be a tough day.
Yes.
So that's very good. And Paulo, as I recall, your educational background began in psychology and kind of the
Yes.
social psychology work. Is this idea of empathy and understanding how it fits in their life? Does it have a basis in some of that work that you did from an academic standpoint?
Yes, and let me pull this back a bit, because if the topic is on creative process, I was thinking about the question. And I look at myself in a few lenses. One right now, and my current profession, I'm actually more of a creative buyer in a sense, because I buy creative work, or I procure creative work with our ad agencies. I'm also a creative facilitator in the sense of trying to get our own marketing teams, especially in the innovation front, to be doing the ideation themselves, and to be discovering the insights. Now, yes, a lot of the let's say my focus on understanding people at the life level and the work of empathy does have strong roots in psychology, but I would even pull it back one step further. Is that the first reason that I went into psychology actually it's more deeply rooted in the theater background that I had, and this was more in high school and in college, where I was very fascinated with the work of theater, and that's where I describe myself as a creator. Where I'm not just a buyer of creativity, but I was quite involved in the creative process, both as an actor and as a playwright. And for me, in that particular field, empathy is critical. Empathy with the characters that you portray on stage. But the wonderful thing about theater also as a creative form is that it's a form where you actually co-create with your audience. Yes, you've got the script. Yes, you've got lines to deliver and blocking to adhere to, more or less. If you like your director and you don't ad lib.
Yes.
But the real theater experience is really that emotional dialogue that you're having with the audience, and that type of emotional dialogue is, I would say, quite unique in the theater or in live performing arts, because the show isn't the show without the audience response. And the work of empathy in theater it's not only essential, it's actually quite brutal. That if you don't have the empathy as an actor for your character and for your audience, the show will not fly. It will not succeed. And so for me, a lot of, I would say, my own creative process in a professional field is influenced a lot by the things that I've learned in my younger years in the theater.
Wow.
Well, thanks for sharing that, because these are things that you don't always see on the resume,
No.
and they're not on the,
Well, it's interesting to see
underneath.
Yeah, I mean,
your
all of
experience.
us bring everything we've done and who we are to what we're doing currently, and we flavor it in a unique way, don't we? And we can see that in what you've just explained to us, Paolo.
Yes.
Yeah. And are you able to use any of these, theater and play techniques in any of your brainstorming sessions, ideation sessions?
Yes.
How does that work with your team to really, I can imagine you've got to spark their creativity and, like you said, get them thinking out of the box too.
Yes. One of the core elements of any brief that we have is the contextual insight of the consumer, which then, by the way, becomes the core of let's call it a communication brief. We also use it for an innovation brief, but let's say in a communication brief, getting the contextual insight right is critical. And for me, two things. One, broadly, you have to have time. You can't make up the contextual insight. It really needs to come from the work that needs to be done in terms of qualitative research, field research, or even just the ethnography work that we do. But then I would say the theater work and the psychology work comes into understanding motivations and understanding that different that how motivations play and how let's say and where do motivations come from and how that influences the end result of a behavior. Roughly speaking, let's say I tend to be very psychoanalytic in my approach, that motivations can be rooted from a feeling level or from a feeling center or a heart center. It can come from a more instinctive gut center, or can come from an idealistic head center. And based on the type of consumer that you have, their motivations may be rooted in one of these centers, and then their approach and response, therefore, to messages, communications, etc., would be very different. And so that's where it kind of blends. I mean, I got into those areas of understanding psychoanalysis, understanding archetypes, etc., because I was not only acting on stage, but in my early years, writing in my own plays. And to be able to develop characters, I had to give them more wholeness. And wholeness comes from an understanding, really, of psychological motivations. So that got me into psychology, and later on into the field of consumer behavior and consumer understanding, which then led me to what I'm doing now.
Yes.
Wow.
Well, and I can imagine that at least in my experience with market research, people aren't always easy to. It's not always easy for them to express their motivations. So you've mentioned things like qualitative interviews, but also ethnography, where
Yes.
you're literally interacting, watching,
Yes.
getting the feelings of the consumer. What sort of techniques or what sort of processes from an ethnography standpoint do you guys apply?
What we watch for is, or what I always tell my team is, okay, you come in with a discussion guide, but listen for feelings and not just words. So that's one of the things that we're quite conscious of. So when a conversation generates excitement and fast responding and a lot of smiles and expressiveness, we take note of that, hey, this is a passion subject, or we're touching on to something that's quite important to the consumer. For our ad testing, actually, we work with a research agency that actually records facial expressions, and we pay attention to that when we craft the advertising, just to make sure that we're hitting the right emotional cues as well. So that's nonverbal. I mean, they may rate the ad in a particular way from a rational aspect, but then we also see that, look, if they're rating, that they like it, but they're actually not smiling, we know we're not hitting the right buttons
Yes.
on this one. So that's part of it. And together with some of our ad agencies, and even our research partners, I like very much the use of the archetypes when describing essentially how we portray our brand, and the archetypes that our consumers in the market, let's say, are used to from a cultural point of view. So if we portray the brand as a hero, what are the archetypes of a hero from pop culture that always, let's say, hit the right buttons for the consumer? So then we go into that aspect. So that's where both psychology, cultural context needs to come into play into the creative process.
Oh, this is great. Thanks for sharing those tools. It's interesting you're talking about the facial recognition. I remember years ago, before a lot of the technology that we have now, I had a mentor who suggested, just when you watch the videos of the research, turn the volume down and just watch the body language.
Yes.
Are they smiling, like you said? Are they leaning up and engaged in the conversation, or are they back, or their arms crossed?
Yeah.
Are they engaged? And so these nonverbal cues are very important. And the archetypes is a great tool as well. I also, we were talking just before we came on the recording about your background in academia at the
Mm,
Berlin School
yes.
of Creative Thinking. And I'm very interested in uh, how you take you've been describing the practical applications of creativity, but to step back into an academic study of creativity,
Mhm.
what were some of your key takeaways from those studies?
Well, the Berlin School, so it's an executive MBA program. It's actually at the core of it. It's not so much about studying creativity per se or how to be creative, and they're very clear on that when you sign up. But it's really about how do you manage and lead creativity as a resource for your company. So it is about managing creative people and creative resources geared towards essentially business productivity. So it sounds quite I would say it sounds a bit different from an artistic creative process, but it is um, let's say the challenge of the times, because and I can talk a bit more about my area of focus in that study. But when you really take a look at companies today, and this is something I'm still trying to convince my own company, that the value of a company, everyone always says the value of the company is its people. But at the core of it, the value of a company is the creativity of its people, their ability to contribute to building new ideas that create value in society or at the very least for the customers that they serve. And and the let's say the big concept of the Berlin School is that most MBA programs were created in an industrial age, and let's say and have very um, industrial process style of management and leadership in terms of creating highly efficient organizations rather and very productive organizations, but geared towards quite a an old model of economies of scale and creating efficiencies and managing the bottom line, both the top line and the bottom line. But it doesn't really pay attention to the person in the organization as a creator, and how do you as a manager build, first of all, recruit creativity into your organization, retain that creative power, that creative, let's say, for lack of a better word, gold mine of talent in your organization, and how do you nurture it? How do you nurture it with the environment? How do you nurture it with policies? How do you nurture it with a work culture that keeps people wanting to be creative and productive for your company? So that's the thrust of Berlin School, and for me, I found it really, really quite an interesting um, program. I try to put it into practice in managing my own teams and working with my own, let's say, advertising and even research suppliers. But to a greater extent, also, I've turned it into an advocacy, which is the other dimension of what I'm doing now in leading this advocacy on creative economy. But I can talk about that a bit more
We
later.
definitely want to get into that. You've raised a few very interesting points that I wanted to take apart a little bit more, and that I really liked your twist on it's not just the people as assets, but the creativity of people.
Mhm.
But you also mentioned, how do you recruit and nurture and grow it? How would you say you can evaluate one's creativity through the recruiting and hiring and onboarding process?
Oh. frankly, I wish I had a better system, you
Yeah,
know,
I was going to say.
for it. I mean, if you have a technique, I'd certainly love it.
Yes.
It's difficult. It's really difficult, especially in the context of Nestle, which in the first place I have to convince to recruit for creativity and not just for, let's say, the more functional technical skills of brand marketing and management. I need to go back a bit to uh, my my learning experience. I wouldn't say successes, but my learning experience with when I was managing an ad agency and trying to recruit creative talent. What I can say is that, well, clearly, portfolio history is part of it. And the first interview, honestly, that's not very helpful if it's just a standard interview. Um, Ultimately, I would really say it needs to be about, will the person fit into the creative culture that you're trying to develop? And that, I would say, would be unique depending on each organization. And generally, there are a couple of, let's say, strong models. One model is the Steve Jobs model, where you have a genius-led creative organization, and he is surrounded, and they push for excellence, and they attract people of a very, very high caliber. But it's also a pressure tank that everyone is pressured to perform to a standard that is essentially defined by the creative leader. Most ad agencies have a history of that model. But then alternative models that people have is really the collaborative, or I wouldn't say wisdom of the crowd, but definitely working groups as the source of creativity. You tend to see that more with Google. Today doesn't seem to be a monolithic creator, but really creative teams that emerge. They have their own ways of working and their own way of raising their creative output, but it's more team based rather than individual based. So I think recruiting and finding the creativity first needs to be rooted in how the organization itself understands its own creative process, and then they must recruit according to that.
That's great.
Yeah.
And the age old question, can a person become more creative? People say, oh, he's so creative, as if it's inborn. But can you develop a creative muscle? Can it be improved?
Yes, because the opposite is true. Can it atrophy? And if it can, and definitely I have seen and experienced on a personal level times when my own creativity is, you really get into a slump. And I've seen also very high performing creative people get into a slump. So when you see, if the opposite is true, that people can deteriorate in that creativity, then almost by definition, there are circumstances that allow them to improve. And I would say it's a it's a tricky balance of the right environment where you have um, uh, it's tricky. People say a lot about psychological safety, creating safe space, etc. But at the same time, a lot of brilliant ideas come from extremely unsafe psychological environments, and in the sense that when in my experience working with some very, very brilliant creative people, they can be quite brutal to their team in terms of critiquing ideas, etc. So there is that tricky balance of critique, collaboration, competitiveness, and always pushing for a higher standard. So these things are necessary in my view, for creativity to really flourish. That competition and pressure, I do believe, is essential to getting the creative environment right. Um, Maybe I'll talk.
This is good.
Yeah. I want to
Well,
give a couple of examples on this one, but yeah, I'm sure.
please do. Now, because I think as we, I won't say elevate, but at least as we focus now on personal development, not just business or professional development. If somebody says, look, I want to pursue a creative avenue, whether it's in theater, like you were talking about your own personal experience, but, music, dance, writing of any kind. And somebody says, I really need some tools. And if we think about it like a muscle, it needs to be exercised. And so I am curious about some of your examples of maybe methods or tools or processes one could access to improve their own creativity.
A couple of points. One is the importance of getting the right mentor and the right support group. And by mentor, it's almost like a coach, actually. I don't like to use the word mentor, but I prefer to use the word coach or even trainer in the athletic sense. That, yes, you've got your skills, but the person should be sharp enough to say that, look, in a let's say a global standard of creative excellence, you are actually more towards here, to give you the truth of where you stand as a whether it's a copywriter or a film director or a playwright, etc. And to say that if you want to improve, you have to put in the work. And that's the most productive creatives always talk about, that there's a discipline. It's not just inspiration or artistic view all the time. They put in the hours, they put in the work of practicing, whether it's a musical instrument or a writing, or in their filmmaking. They put in the hours to that. But then also they don't hide the work. They put it in a venue that allows it to be critiqued, and that's where courage comes in. The courage to put the work out there, to acknowledge that your work may not be the best, and if you get applauded, great. But if you get critiqued, use that as an opportunity to get better and better and better. So for me, it's really that combination of putting in the work, being open to critique, but then use critique to push yourself to be better. And for me, that's where, from an environment point of view, the one thing that I don't think, or the idea that I think is outdated, is the lone artist with a vision, and then who secludes himself like a hermit, and then comes out with a brilliant, let's say, masterpiece after years of incubating the idea. What I do see more and more is that creative environments requires actually communities of creative people who, most of the time, they compete with each other, but in the competition they actually collaborate in a way to make each other's work better. My favorite example, going back to my personal history in theater, is Broadway. It's just crazy how Broadway is. I forget the estimate of how many billions of dollars that it earns. It's such a small area of New York, leading global theater, and I think there are only about 40 performing spaces. But the intensity of competition, for audiences, for getting the show right, but at the same time, while they're competing with each other, the theater community is actually a collaborative community. The actors know each other, the directors know each other, they know whose play is coming on. They support each other actually when their play is coming on. So there is that aspect of both collaborating, being encouraging, but also competing. When your show is on, when my show is on, we're all competing for audience share. And that dynamic of proximity, creating competition, creating markets that people buy for, is then replicated not only in Broadway, it's been replicated in Silicon Valley, it's been replicated in Hollywood, and now more and more these creative clusters are coming out. in different countries. And I do feel that's a key dynamic to nurturing creativity, to be part of community, to be part of these clusters.
And in building those communities, entire economies come out of that. You were mentioning that's another part of your efforts right now is building creative community, expanding creative economies. Tell us more about what some of your efforts are in that area.
Yes. So that was actually my thesis in Berlin School. So I was fascinated with the subject of creative economy, which is essentially a country-based agenda of recognizing creative industries as a unique sector, understanding its current contribution to GDP, and then setting a roadmap to accelerating growth, both through domestic and international trade in creative output, whether the output is a product or an idea. Ideas meaning intellectual property licenses or patent, etc. And the gap that I saw in the Philippines is that there's no at the time that I was writing, there was still no formal recognition of creative industries as an economic contributor. So what started off as a thesis and understanding current state in the Philippines, it soon grew to be, I would say, a very time-consuming advocacy, because the people in government that I was interviewing, primarily from the Department of Trade and Industries, the National Commission on Culture and the Arts, and a few other government agencies, they were telling me, you can't leave that as an academic thesis. Can you be an advisor to us as the government now crafts its own creative economy agenda? So that's what I've been doing on the side, and there are several avenues to that, including the development of creative clusters, getting local cities to adopt their own city-based creative economy agenda. Creative education is part of it, as well as even creative tourism, using creative festivals as a way to develop new streams of tourism. So yeah, it's quite. I would say it's quite a heavy involvement that sort of came out of that very simple academic thesis.
How much did you have to sell them on that, or were they ready to receive that? It sounds like they are on board with what you're doing.
They were, I would say, at least the people in government I've been talking to, the Department of Trade and Industry, they had been exploring the idea about 10 years earlier in 2005. The gap is, I would say, and maybe that's where I was at the right place at the right time. They were working with academics previously and not people from the creative industries. And the other aspect of it was that the problem that they had was that in the Philippines, like in many countries, while the creative sectors have their own, let's say, industry organization, the government had a problem in finding who is the one group that I talk to if I want to understand the full landscape of creative industries in the Philippines. Then the other aspect, which also made it a bit challenging for them, was that they were constantly confusing. And even today, I have to remind people that the creative economy policy is different from an arts and culture policy. There are overlaps, but an art and culture policy is more about growing cultural identity, and where art is seen as part of cultural identity. And that's a different agenda. It's legitimate. But creative economy, it's about contribution to the economy through job creation and actual revenue. And I guess my business background plus my appreciation for the creative industries, not only through advertising, but through performing arts. My wife, actually, her parents are visual artists. So there's a circle of art and creatives that I personally am aware of that allowed me to navigate the space in a way that is, I would say, well, that the government is finding useful. Yeah.
Yes. Well, you're also bringing up a good point about the commercial interests of creativity. That coming up with ideas or coming up with art for art's sake, a painting that belongs in a museum is different than a painting that might be in a gallery for sale, or even different than art created for, say, advertising purposes. But you're also bringing up this idea of execution. That coming up with the idea is one thing, but executing or implementing the idea. And I'm very interested in your experience in bridging that gap to make sure it's not just creativity for creativity's sake.
Well, that's where my marketing background comes in. In creative economy, creations serve a market. And that's not my idea. That's in the book of, let's say, one of the thought leaders in creative economy, Professor John Hawkins, that creativity needs freedoms. Everyone is born creative. But one of his major tenets on creative ecology is that creativity needs markets. Because without markets, without people who consume creativity, whether it's a piece of content or an app that they like to use or a game that they use, without the market, then it's more a personal statement that some people can appreciate. But generally, it is really about creating these, whether it's a product or content or an experience that serves an audience, a consuming audience. And for me, that's what I keep bringing into the conversation and into the ideation around creative economy policy.
Oh, that's wonderful. So I'm mindful of our time, and it's been just a terrific conversation. But I'd like to kind of end our discussion as we get more on a personal level for you, Paolo. If tomorrow you woke up and you had a challenge in front of you on your desk, after your Nescafe, which is going to give you that first boost, but where would you go? You say, I'm stuck. I need a boost of creativity. Where would you go to get unstuck? What would inspire you? What would give you a fresh spark?
Personally, my process is, and maybe this is really from left field, but my process is I run or I bike to the point of exhaustion. So running and cycling for me, between the two, more cycling is very centering, in the sense that there's a certain Zen-like thing to cycling where you have to keep very focused to keep that bike upright and not get hit by a car, and it clears the mind in some way. And I always get when I'm really faced with a challenge, I really literally just ride my bike. Somehow that does get literally the juices flowing. It clears my mind because I do it at a high intensity. And then at the moment when I am resting and recovering, that's when I try to approach things in a different way. I know it kind of sounds funny as a process, but it works for me. That's what I often do. When I'm really stuck, I go out and ride my bike.
We hear that a lot from other creative people, that there's something about getting the brain, really, and getting that heart pounding that works a lot.
Yes.
I'm also interested, our theme of our podcast here is a world of creativity. And I've only been to the Philippines twice, but I found Manila to be a very vibrant, multicultural city. You've lived and worked in Asia. What do you see as the sort of cultural environment for creativity, and what that kind of diversity brings?
Philippine creativity, and I go back also to something that's also core to me. Actually, empathy and reading feelings is quite important as a cultural trait. it is, if you look at the areas where the Filipino excels as an artist, it tends to be not conceptual creativity, not even high level design. We have very few designers who break through, but we do break through in artistic or creative forms that are about human empathy. So so one very concrete example is that the Filipino is the greatest number of Asian talent on Broadway is Filipino, and it's the same in the West End. And if you take a look at any bar or performance venue or cruise ship or even Disneyland Hong Kong, majority of the performers there are Filipino. And it's not just because we sing well, but it's also because we convey a very strong emotion when we perform. And when you take a look at other areas where Filipino as a creative punches into, let's say, a level of global excellence, it tends to be in forms that show a lot of human emotion. So some of the lead animators in Pixar are Filipino, and they tend to have subject matters that are much more emotional in nature. Like the animators in Coco, and there's another one, the one about precisely the one about the emotions, Inside Out. So those are Filipinos around that, and even in some of the comic and illustrative forms. So it is in our language one of the most, let's say, important trait of the Filipino is understanding and reading the room as far as the emotional state of people before you state your point of view or your position, that you need to feel, and the word is pakikiramdam. You have to feel the room, and you have to go with what the group, fully understand where the group is before you push your way through. And that's the way we create as well. It's a very empathetic, let's say, creative expression.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Paolo, for this engaging conversation. I've learned a lot. And as we summarize and conclude here, I'd be very interested to think about and get your opinion on what you think the state of creativity in the world today. How are we doing as a global creative community?
I've never thought of that. I would say definitely we have been, and this is especially true in the digital world, have been through a tremendous boom of new ideas, and the level of creativity is very high. But I think also we're coming to a point where we are creating monsters as well, that may not have been there in the inception, but then they have these effects that we don't intend. So in the, of course, social media and the impact of social media on the fabric of society has been written about several times, but it's even in the creativity in innovation, and one of them being the hot topic right now in the US and in other countries on e-cigarettes. But how a very highly creative and innovative product like Juul, which was intended for helping people quit, had the unintended effect of actually recruiting people to smoke. So I think we have a point where creativity and imagination, there is no absence of it whatsoever. But I think we're coming to a point where, do we need to put to market every creative idea we have just because it will sell and it will have a market? So is there a point on, and I was talking to Michael Barry, who teaches at the D School in Stanford, and the conversation is there an ethic to innovation and creativity that we need to start taking a look at? Are there opportunities that we shouldn't fulfill? Or should we really ask the impact of releasing this into market? So I think we're getting to that point. Definitely creativity is alive and well. But I think we're also getting to a point on understanding that should we really go to market? What is the impact of this on the fabric of society? And there are those cases that are coming out, and I think that will might put a break or slow down the pace of innovation.
Well, it's a very thought-provoking point, this sort of ethical consideration of creativity.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. Paolo, it's been terrific talking with you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Paolo. We do appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm happy to contribute.
Wow, what a great interview, Mark.
It is terrific. We just want to thank Paolo Mercado, who's the SVP of Marketing, Communications, and Innovation at Nestle in the Philippines, for this terrific interview. I think as I took away, that we were talking about the sound bites that we could have got out of this, but three main takeaways for me is the idea of customer or consumer intimacy, that Paolo really thought from a creativity standpoint, to offset this number crunching and analytic side of the brain. You can watch the sales numbers and you can watch the ratings of, various advertising. But the idea that you need to get close to the customer in a very meaningful way to understand their emotions, to understand their motivations. I thought that was terrific. And it really drove everything they did. And this word empathy came out very strong throughout the interview. The second point, and we've heard this phrase so many times, that the greatest assets of a company are its people. He added and twisted that, didn't he, to be the creativity of its people are a company's greatest assets. And I just thought that was terrific, and that they would recruit and hire and nurture and grow the creativity of the people as a big asset. This idea that we were shifting from this iconic creative leadership where there was one person, and he mentioned Stephen Jobs, but there's others, that we're moving from this icon creative leader to more collaborative team approach. And that's been a pretty consistent theme in our other interviews, that this idea of a world of creativity is that we need a diverse world,
community,
of
the
a team.
lone person. A number of people have mentioned that, haven't they?
Yeah, no lone wolf anymore. And I guess the last thing was that if you start as an individual and then you move to a creative team, ultimately it ladders up to a creative economy and a creative cluster in a town, in a country. And his work in these kind of creative economies, I thought was very fascinating. And we sort of were kidding him that it was just a side job, that as a part-time entity, he was working with government to try to build the creative economy. But it's a very worthwhile undertaking, and I think he's just the kind of person that can lead it, because he was talking about moving from just maybe art and culture creativity to the economic and commercial development of an economy using creativity as a foundation.
Yeah. His interview was a lot like Kevin Fox's interview, where there are artists that are actually affecting, revenue and driving revenue for companies and stuff like that. And they have that ability to span the gap. I think some people cannot do that, right? Where you're just business mindset or you're just artist, you don't have the ability to kind of span that gap.
That's right. And he was weaving his stories from theater and playwright, all through his interview. And it just reminded me, when we're interviewing people for jobs, for example, I always like to go to the bottom of the resume. Where are the interests and the hobbies, and what was your first job, and what was your side interest in college, or something like that. Because, on Paolo's LinkedIn profile, you're not going to find theater major, actor, playwright, and yet that is central to his creative foundation. And so, yes, he has degrees, and yes, he has titles and great company experience. But look how much it was informed by his, more creative personal interest in the theater, even his Broadway stories and analogies and things like that. So as people, as we get to know people, or if we're interviewing people for gigs or for jobs, it teaches me anyway to dig deeper into the individual and get to know them and their total picture, not just what's listed on their job experience on a resume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he definitely has that going on. One of the things that I found interesting was when he was talking about coming from the industrial era into this era that we find ourselves in now, how it almost sounds like it was just about production. And I think it was easier back then from what I've read and from what I understand. It was like, here's a product, here's a name, here's a couple of colors, people buy it. But now it seems like the marketplace is much more, there's a more need for creativity. And he spoke to that and he said, hey, you need to be more creative now because there's so much noise out there. There's so much, it's not as easy as slapping a name on something, is
That's
it?
right. That's right. So
Yeah.
just a fantastic interview. And there's a lot of other connections that people like Paolo can make. So it's just wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that puts another one in the bank. We've got a few more down the road. So stay tuned for the next one.
Yeah. And then we're excited as we wrap up the series. We'll be coming back to you with a summary of all the interviews. So that'll be one to listen for.
Definitely. All right. Thanks so much. All the best. Health, wealth, and success.
Thanks for listening to this special edition of Enhancing the Human Experience, a World of Creativity with Mark Phillips. If you liked this episode and want to know more, check out gmarkphillips.com and please leave us a review on YouTube, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.